We must not miss this unique window of opportunity. For this reason, I'm grateful that we are joined for this announcement of the Great Reset Initiative, not only by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, but by representatives of international organizations, business, trade unions, scientists, and above all, the young generation. Now we have the very special message from the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Your Royal Highness, Professor Schwab, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I send you my warmest greetings and best wishes on the launch of the Great Reset. The COVID-19 pandemic is causing enormous human suffering and economic hardship. A microscopic virus has closed down entire countries and economies. In doing so, it has exposed the fragility that characterizes much of our world. But this fragility is not confined to health systems. Runaway climate change, unsustainable levels of inequality, and the lawlessness of cyberspace are all warning signs that we must heed. The Great Reset is a welcome recognition that this human tragedy must be a wake-up call. As you rightly say, it is imperative that we reimagine, rebuild, redesign, reinvigorate, and rebalance our world.
Therefore, what should be the principles that underlie the reshaping of a new and better global economic system? To seize this window of opportunity, I believe we need to do 5 things. First of all, to create momentum for the Great Reset, we need to capture the imagination and will of humanity. We will only change if we really want to change. Secondly, the global economic recovery must set us on a new trajectory of sustainable employment, of livelihoods and economic growth. To achieve scale, we must not be afraid to reorientate our long-standing incentive structures, which have been having such perverse effects on our planetary environment and on nature herself, if we are to reap the benefits afforded by a more sustainable world. Thirdly, we must redesign systems and pathways to advance net zero transitions globally. And in this regard, carbon pricing can form a critical pathway to genuinely sustainable markets. This reset moment is our opportunity to accelerate and align our efforts to create truly global momentum.
Now is the time to think what history would say about this crisis. And now is the time for all of us to define our own role. Will history say that was the great reversal? And we actually today see very worrisome signs. 170 countries are going to finish this year with a smaller economy than they started. And we already project that there will be more debt, more deficit, more unemployment, and there is a very high risk of more inequality and more poverty unless we act. And that takes me to what is it that would make it so that history would look at this crisis as the great opportunity for reset. From the perspective of the IMF, what we see is inevitably a very massive injection of fiscal stimulus to help countries deal with this crisis and shift gear for growth to return.
Welcome everyone, I'm Spiro, thanks for tuning in. We've all heard the phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste, and I would say that applies even if the crisis is engineered. We've also heard the phrase, order out of chaos, which is a strategy that I believe we are seeing unfold before our eyes. Now, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the Hegelian dialectic, which is problem, reaction, solution. If you have a goal of, let's say, global governance, you may not be able to just roll this out because you'll be met with resistance, and there may be little to no justification for this agenda. So you engineer a crisis, in this case, a global health pandemic, a scenario we have seen war-gamed in documents such as the 2010 Rockefeller Lockstep document and Event 201, the tabletop exercise and simulation of a global coronavirus pandemic. that was sponsored by the World Economic Forum, Johns Hopkins, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which took place last October. This crisis, which I believe to be engineered, produces a desired response: a controlled demolition of the global economy, wiping out the middle class, creating more dependency upon the government in the form of stimulus money and bailouts, which essentially equate to ownership. We experienced the authoritarian lockdowns, which was the conclusion of the Rockefeller Lockstep document on how to mitigate this crisis. Now, we are also witnessing massive civil unrest under the guise of seeking social justice and ending inequalities and systemic racism, as they call it, when in reality, these riots are nothing more than an organized destabilization operation, much like the ones we have seen the U.S. and the CIA carry out in countless countries before they topple their governments and install puppet regimes. This is a planned operation. So back to the problem, reaction, solution strategy. We have the engineered problem, COVID-19. We have the reaction, the economic collapse and the civil unrest, and now it's time for the solution, a solution which has already been predetermined, prepackaged, and ready to roll out. The solution was just announced by the World Economic Forum, the same World Economic Forum who asked Johns Hopkins to host Event 201. Their solution is what they are calling the Great Reset, an initiative that was officially launched this week. Now, the Great Reset is not a new idea that they just made up over the weekend, okay? This is a long-standing global governance agenda which ties into the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which seeks to regulate, control, and redefine all aspects of life as we know it. And in June of last year, the United Nations and the World Economic Forum formed a strategic partnership to accelerate the implementation of the UN 2030 Agenda. Now, here is a quote from the World Economic Forum about the Great Reset, directly from their website. In fact, one silver lining of the pandemic is that it has shown how quickly we can make radical changes to our lifestyles. Almost instantly, the crisis forced businesses and individuals to abandon practices long claimed to be essential, from frequent air travel to working in an office. Back in January of this year, 2020, the World Economic Forum founder and executive chairman Klaus Schwab was asked, "What can we expect to be the focus of Davos 2020?" And he referenced his book from 1970 on a new economic model called stakeholder capitalism.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, it's the headquarters of the World Economic Forum, which is celebrating 50 years as its founder. What does that mean to you personally?
It doesn't mean celebrating 50 years of Davos or of our existence. For me, it means to celebrate 50 years of the stakeholder concept, of stakeholder capitalism, because I wrote the book in 1970 and conceptualized, probably for the first time, what we call today stakeholder capitalism. And I wanted to create a place where stakeholders could meet. And that was the original idea of Davos. So I'm very pleased and happy that we are not only celebrating 50 years, but we are celebrating now finally that stakeholder capitalism has become or is becoming mainstream.
When we look on the World Economic Forum's website, we see that stakeholder capitalism is one of the main objectives of this Great Reset. At the time of the interview back in January of 2020, the stock market was at all-time highs, and the sense of urgency for a new economic model really wasn't there.
I see also, I would call it, that we have urgency in emergency related to the environmental issues, climate change, but also biodiversity and so on. We face an emergency situation, and we have not yet really the sense of urgency to address those issues. We see it now with the fires in Australia, and of course, it's relatively difficult to get such a sense of urgency if the stock markets are doing so well as we see now.
Now we have economic conditions comparable to that of the Great Depression due to the fallout from the coronavirus lockdowns. And now, lo and behold, we have the justification for the Great Reset and the 50-year-old plan for the new economic system. Now, just 3 days ago, the World Economic Forum hosted a virtual summit for the Great Reset. Attendees included Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, the United Nations Secretary General Guterres, Prince Charles, the head of the International Monetary Fund, and a top representative from MasterCard, among many others. And the general consensus was that we cannot afford to miss this window of opportunity to implement the Great Reset because COVID has shown our current system to be broken.
The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. It has laid bare the fundamental lack of social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system for the need for the post-corona era.
The Great Reset is a welcome recognition that this human tragedy must be a wake-up call. As you rightly say, it is imperative that we reimagine, rebuild, redesign, reinvigorate, and rebalance our world.
But these are unprecedented times. Every person on the planet has been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Our world came to a standstill, and it became clear that we did not have the answer or the mechanisms to address such an unprecedented global threat. The threats posed by this dreadful pandemic came upon us suddenly with very little warning. The threat of climate change has been more gradual, but its devastating reality for many people and their livelihoods around the world, and its ever greater potential to disrupt, surpasses even that of COVID-19. We have a golden opportunity to seize something good from this crisis. Its unprecedented shockwaves may well make people more receptive to big visions of change. And global crises like pandemics and climate change know no borders and highlight just how interdependent we are as one people sharing one planet.
History would look at this crisis as the great opportunity for reset. From the perspective of the IMF, what we see is inevitably a very massive injection of fiscal stimulus to help countries deal with this crisis and shift gear for growth to return. But it is paramount that this growth leads to a greener, smarter, and more fairer world in the future. I'm particularly keen to take advantage of the low oil prices today to eliminate harmful subsidies and to bring in place carbon price as an incentive for the investments for the future. Secondly, we know the digital economy is the big winner of this crisis.
We have a choice to remain passive, which would lead to the amplification of many of the trends we see today: polarization, nationalism, racism, and ultimately increased social unrest and conflicts. But we have another choice. We can build a new social contract, particularly integrating the next generation. We can change our behavior to be in harmony with nature again. And we can make sure that the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are best utilized to provide us with better lives. In short, we need a great reset.
If this video has resonated with you, discover Awakening Pro and awake like a pro. With Awakening Pro you will get access to all our information. Also you will benefit from the huge amount of funds that we will get for humanitarian and ecological projects worldwide.